want to introduce Robbie Izzard. She is the executive assistant for the bishop and has been for 3 bishops. In the past 30 years, she was also appointed by the victim assistance coordinator at Safe Environment coordinator. I can't talk today. In 2002 by Bishop Michael Warfel. She has 3 grown children and 4 grandsons who live right here in Juneau. And she has been in Juneau since 1970. So, very knowledgeable lady. Please welcome.
Thank you. For those of you who were around this weekend, Dr. Jonathan Reyes, and in fact all of the presenters, kept talking to us about a culture of mercy, creating a culture of mercy. And I don't know that any place that happens more importantly than in religious education. And I think that's our call here, too, anybody who works with children, to be that compassionate listener for the children who show up for our classes and for each other. I really, really enjoy it when I find information, good information that speaks to me, and all of a sudden I'm finding it from a lot of different directions. That kind of helps me know that this is something to really pay attention to. I think spiritual truth is kind of the same wherever you find it, but you may find it in a lot of different places. I have for years gone into the schools. I've been asked to come in and help in health classes and different classes to talk about. There was a peer counseling group in the high school for a while, and the health teacher wanted someone to come in and work with these people so that they could work with other kids, with each other. And she knew I was doing groups at the time on codependency, which is kind of, sort of, has to do with shame, sort of shame-based realities. People who have a hard time setting boundaries, or people who sometimes get taken advantage of. So she had these students who wanted to be helpers, student helpers of others. But their dilemma was that as they began helping other kids, they took on the dilemma of the children, because these were your compassionate children to start with. They were the ones who volunteered to do these things. These are the people who will grow up and become teachers and nurses and people in the helping professions. So we actually did a codependency group in the high school, and we came up with this tree. This is, at the time, this is what we call the Tree of Codependency. And it's, we start out talking about the roots of the tree. Codependency is also, childhood trauma creates shame-based people. And that's really what codependency is. People who have challenges from their story, somewhere in their story, and they become not as strong, not as powerful, not as self-assured as you would hope that they might be as young adults and adults. The dilemma with this is, with the childhood trauma, is that as adults, what happens to these perfectly wonderful people and these wonderful children who were damaged somewhere along the line is the fruits of the tree. Here's the roots and here are the fruits, tend to become self-destructive behaviors. Tend to become things like alcoholism and drug addiction and smoking. We talk about the chemical addictions, and then we talk about the process addictions. And process addictions are things like overeating, overspending, being a workaholic, being a gambler, people with eating disorders. These are all things that come out of childhood trauma, which is one of the reasons we want to intervene with childhood trauma as early as we can in somebody's life. Because the sooner those things are addressed and people begin to get help for it, the better the prognosis for how it goes down the line. So I'm going to hand out this little tree here so you guys can follow along with me and see what I'm talking about. And every time I've given this talk, I have had people say, let me show you what some of these are. I've added to my tree every single time I've done the talk. I have either added to some of the childhood traumas or added to some of the dilemmas that come out in our adult life. In fact, I've got some that aren't even on this tree. Childhood traumas are things like physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, obviously, abandonment, children who were abandoned. And these are dilemmas of either the child or dilemmas just of the family. And it's not necessarily things that were done to the child deliberately. In fact, in most cases it wasn't. It was simply circumstantial. Some families are in poverty. Some families have divorce is one of the dilemmas that can impact the children in the family, a death in the family of anybody. Spiritual abuse, spiritual neglect, and this is where we run into clergy sexual abuse. That type of abuse in a child is incredibly damaging. A death of anyone, pain, crime, physical illness, mental illness, which is just as damaging as addiction, having parents who have addiction problems. I did this talk to the Clinton and Haida group one time, and someone stood up and said, well, you know, most of our families have all of these things, you know, poverty, crime, shame. And she says, but you didn't even write down discrimination. Discrimination of groups of people, which is another dilemma that just sort of adds to it. And the problem is, if you have one challenge in your childhood, chances are really good that you probably have more than one, because a lot of these things go together. And what they're doing now, we're doing studies, and I've just been to a number of workshops on this year, and I'll give you a handout on this too, is what they're calling adverse childhood experiences. Exactly, ACEs. And it's the same chart. It's if bad things happen to you when you were young, it has negative consequences for the rest of your life, or it potentially can. Not necessarily, and I want to read to you a little bit out of a report that's been done on that. But these are the kinds of things that we want to be aware of when we work with children, when we work with families, because these kinds of things can be going on, and we might not know it. And in fact, that's part of it, is that most people would rather you didn't know these things about their families. Most of us who have any of these challenges in our childhood would rather not tell people. We would rather keep it to ourselves. But children, like I said, early intervention is absolutely key to people getting over these things. There are many people my age who are in support groups today working on their childhood trauma issues. And the sooner you begin, and the sooner somebody notices and intervenes and begins to help you, the better off you are and the better your chances of overcoming whatever it is. And there are a lot of ways to do that, which is actually the wonderful news. And the more we study these different problems, the more we realize where we should intervene, what we should do, what helps and what doesn't help. And being awareness is probably the biggest thing. The state of Alaska just did a big study, adverse childhood experiences. You know, in the state of Alaska has a very high rate. I have a poster in my office that says Alaska has, it's a beautiful picture of Mount Denali, and it says, we have the highest mountains and the highest rates of childhood abuse, domestic violence, alcoholism, drug addiction of any state in the country. And we do. And it's one of the challenges of living here in the great land is that's part of our dilemma. On the early childhood experiences chart, the ones that they used were physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, living with someone with mental illness, living with someone with substance abuse, separation or divorce, living with someone who went to jail or prison, which I didn't even have on here until I think I put it on, and then witnessing domestic violence. And just those 8. And we have others on here. And all of these things cause shame in the child and eventually in the adult. So we're looking for ways to intervene with families, and that's one of the reasons that we talk about. One of the things you can do is, if you suspect that a child is being harmed, please let somebody know. Please turn it over. It doesn't mean that the family's going to be destroyed. It doesn't mean that everything is going to be ruined. It just means that somebody's going to begin to take a look And whatever it is that's going on, hopefully somewhere down the line, it will be resolved, or it will turn out to have been a non-issue. But people need to pay attention. We need to pay attention to each other. We're to be careful of each other. So this is another big report of a big 4-part series on health, hope, and healing that was done in a Catholic magazine about the clergy abuse crisis. And of course, that's one of the biggest forms of childhood trauma, is having been abused by clergy as children. And they talk about how childhood abuse and neglect take their toll on children. And this also quotes the ACEs study. And this study says over a third of people had no childhood dilemmas, but that means that the other 2/3 did, and some people had 4 or more. And in fact, if you've got several, the chances are that you have quite a number. So one of the quotes in this article was, if churches are to be field hospitals, as Pope Francis so eloquently suggests, we should all understand who the patients really are and what they suffer, even when they don't look obviously injured. The abused and neglected are not them, they are us. I've never done this talk and had anybody say to me, I had none of those in my story. I had none of these things as part of my story. If any of you can say that, I would be happy to hear about it. As far as I'm concerned, this is the human condition. This is the human dilemma. This is part of how it is. But the problem with adverse childhood experiences is that they do affect every aspect of ourselves. They affect our physical health, and that's what this report is all about how people with many challenges when they were small grow up not just to have emotional problems, but to have actually physical problems. It's like our physical body picks up on, often it's the stress. A lot of these children were under a great deal of stress when they were small, and they were in this fight or flight mode, which is very hard on your body. It's very hard on your system. Their ability to remember and pay attention is damaged if there's challenges going on at home. They did PET scans of children who they knew had trauma in their life, and the actual picture of their brain looks different than that of a normal child under no stress. So it makes a huge difference, and we do want to know, and it interferes with relationships, which is how I've ended up with a number of people that I do workshops for people who self-identify as having childhood trauma. And so that's a lot of the solution is, what do you do to kind of repair that? What do you do to overcome those challenges as adults? And there are some wonderful resources. But a lot of times people will come in to some of the groups that I volunteer with because they're having trouble, relationship problems, or things are not working out, or they're not getting along with other people as well as they had hoped. They're having trouble with their primary relationship or with their job. And it's not surprising that some of the behaviors that children develop growing up in a lot of trauma are not the best behaviors to get through your adult life. And so a lot of the solution is just to learn some better behaviors, to learn some new ways of they say we have to develop a self-care program. And for some people who've been traumatized, that means you really have to do a really good job of taking care of yourself. And that includes being around other people and not isolating is very important, and being willing to share what's going on. And that's part of what we're called to do too as witnesses to these children, is if they come and they have something that they need to share, just listen. Being a compassionate listener is one of the most wonderful things you can do for anybody, for a child or for your friend or for anyone else. And to not give advice, just to listen, just to hear, just to witness somebody else's story. That's one of the things that people say they miss the most, that they need the most, and that's part of the solution for healing. Depending on the nature of their childhood experience, survivors can feel ashamed or worthless, and sometimes are filled with self-loathing because they feel like whatever happened was their fault. Because small children, I studied early childhood education, children in their preschool and even grade school age years are self-absorbed. They believe everything is about them. They believe everything that happens is because of them. And if nobody steps in to say anything different, they carry that into their adult life. And it also talked about spirituality, that that's another way people are wounded. Many of these survivors turn away from a religion or away from God, and because our image of God very often has to do with the way we were parented. Those people were our God figures when we were small. That's what God looks like to most small children, is their mom and their dad. And they may be very, very cautious about that. But the second part of this article talks about there is hope. There's a lot of hope for survivors to heal. It says 2/3 of trauma survivors will experience at least some negative outcomes after the trauma, though another third will emerge to adults who seem not to have been deeply affected. So there's all kinds of reasons why different things happen. Having a fairly optimistic just nature sometimes helps. You feel like you can bounce back. They say a safe, close relationship with at least one adult who was not involved in their trauma is huge. And that's where we come in. We want to be one of those safe adults that these children can say, when I grow up, I'm going to be like Marilyn Monroe. When I grow up, I want to be, like my third grade teacher, because she seems so calm and her life seems so together and she's so sweet to me. She's always nice to me. She always asks me how I feel. That's all they need, is somebody that they can model after. And some kids don't get that, except in school or in church or someplace outside of your home. And it isn't because their parents are deliberately, people don't have a bunch of kids and say, well, let's see what we can do to ruin their little lives. Nobody does that. It's too hard a job. But when the parents were wounded also, it comes through. And so much of this is multi-generational trauma. And that's what we have going on in this state also. So the way to intervene is to just be there for somebody. And to be there for each other, because the other people that you work with, the other people that are your neighbors, the people they say, it's the people that you sit next to in the pews in church. 1 out of 3 of them was probably seriously traumatized as a child, and probably isn't going to tell you about it. Maybe we will get to where we can share. That's, one of the workshops that I do is on shame resiliency. And that is, shame is what keeps us from sharing. It's what keeps us from putting what we have out there so that somebody else can help us look at it, so that somebody can say to us, that really wasn't your fault. That didn't have anything to do with you at all. But if I'm not willing to tell you my story at all, I'm not going to get that kind of feedback. So that's a lot of what we got in this workshop this weekend. They talked about connection. Be willing to share. Be willing to listen. Be willing to share non-judgmentally, your stories with each other, and just listen with an open heart. And that's a lot of what we're called on to do with children. A consistent faith or cultural tradition that provides some hope, some kind of a belief system. So if you get kids coming, it's easy to say, well, I know these families, these are good families, I'm sure everything is fine, but you don't always know. And some of these kids will bring their friends. Welcome those children in. Welcome in any children who show up here. You don't know where they're coming from or, what it is that they need at any point in time, other than that we all need unconditional acceptance. And we need to be treated kindly. And that's how children eventually will develop some resiliency. And that's what we need. That's what we want to build in, not this sense of fear. Sense of humor is good. We want to help people rebuild their ego strength. It's very important for trauma survivors to tell their story to someone else who simply bears witness to it, someone who simply hears it. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to do anything about it. Just be there to listen. And they're talking about hope for people. As adults, there's a lot of things that can be done to overcome some of these dilemmas, and very often people suffer from what they call post-traumatic stress disorder. which is they're very easily triggered by things that go on today because it reminds them of things that happened at another time. And there's ways to work through that. And certainly they encourage people to find counselors. And one of the things that I do, I'm a resource person. My office is a resource office. I have this huge floor-to-ceiling bookcases full of books on every kind of childhood trauma there is, every kind of addiction there is. And I keep lists of all the psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists in Juneau. If you want a list, just let me know and I will email that to you. They do keep it updated. It's a wonderful resource. And it will tell you, who works with trauma, who works with children, who works with, all kinds of different dilemmas. We need help to repair ourselves. They'll say in AA, you can't fix your sick mind with your sick mind. You can't overcome something that you've never had the skills to overcome. You just can't do it by yourself. And shame-based people are afraid to reach out and ask for help because they're afraid they're going to be blamed. So that's kind of the circular dilemma. But we're trying to intervene on that. They'll teach, as people are getting better and looking for help, they'll encourage them, very often children with these traumas end up with adult problems of their own. And sometimes these problems are what get them into counseling for these childhood problems. Their drug addiction or their alcoholism or some eating disorders come out of that. Some, since they're very, very shame-based and feel very bad about themselves, they can get into self-mutilation. A lot of suicide comes from these issues. Spending too much, saving too much, gambling too much, working too much. It's not new, but it's Marilyn Monaco and I went to the workshop for safe environment folks this year, and there were many different workshops and new resources on the issue of pornography, which is getting into teenagers and kids, and it's a huge dilemma. And that's another issue that comes out of distorted relationships and distorted views of yourself and who you are and what you're worth. So we're teaching now, we're having to come up with books and videos for children, and that's just, every year it seems like the challenges get worse, they get bigger. And so they were advertising things that you can put on your computers. This is a program, Clean Router. We use at work Covenant Eyes, which is a program you can put on your computers, which will let the adults know what children are going into if it's something that you didn't want them to be involved with. There's a pastoral response to pornography that's been written. And just seems like every year there's more and more challenges that come out of more and more hurt. So we are the frontline folks who are there to try and intervene as soon as we can. And church is certainly a wonderful place that can happen.
Hey, Robbie, on the rootedness, what's enmeshment?
Enmeshment is children who are too tied to their parents. Parents sometimes, often you'll get maybe a father who's an addict and a mother who is spending a lot of time trying to get the addict to quit doing whatever he's doing, but she tends maybe to bond with the children inappropriately, using them, kind of keeping them at home, so I won't be lonely. It's having an inappropriate relationship, adult to child, which can happen within a family. Some girls are raised to be daddy's little girl, and they feel guilty. In healthy relationship, it's the mom and the dad, and it's their job to have this circle of protection around their children. In dysfunctional families, very often, that's not what happens. It's, the parents will pair up with the children, which leaves the children feeling responsible for the parents, which they aren't. And it sort of robs them of just getting to be a child and having parents watching out for them. That's a good question. And abandonment is another, where the child feels like nobody is watching me because mom's drinking, dad's working all the time, somebody's trying to stop somebody from doing this or that, and who's watching the kids? Nobody. The kids are just kind of fending for themselves. And that's another piece of all of this. So they're talking about how confronting trauma can bring growth. They're actually doing workshops now. They've begun to study in some of the big universities what they're calling post-traumatic growth, which means people who were traumatized, sometimes if they can really deal with that, can actually, not just recover from it, but actually grow from it. And she says the woman who wrote this book starts right out and she says, let me be very clear. No one ever is better off because they were abused or suffered other adverse childhood experiences. Every child and adolescent is entitled to a good enough childhood, whereas their suffering is manageable and betrayal is minimal. Never saying, oh, aren't you lucky that happened? You would never say that. But there are enough people for whom they have had very, very big challenges in their childhood that we're beginning to study, what makes a difference, what makes it better, and how some of these people can grow beyond it. There's a post-traumatic growth experts will talk about a positive psychological change experienced as the result of struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. And if they have the help to do it, very often they'll turn around and become what we call the wounded healers. People who, because of their own trauma, are able to turn around and be incredibly empathic and passionate and with other people. They might be the very people that you would want working with someone with a childhood like this. So they say they're able to embrace the reality that there really is no justice for a survivor of ACEs, because a shattered childhood can never be returned whole. But continued anger and resentment for them is, as the saying goes, like swallowing poison and hoping the other guy dies. These survivors do not want to give any more of their soul space to the trauma or to those who caused it. That's the level that we hope that they would rise to. And it is happening, and we're figuring out how to help people, how to help trauma survivors be able to move beyond it. And one of the things that they're incredibly good at, they were talking about the woman who wrote this book, about how she was in New York City on September the 11th, and she had many clients who were trauma survivors. And she said an enormous number of them jumped in and were first responders and were there to be there in the midst of the tragedy and the trauma, and they were able to remain calm and actually be of help to other people. Again, it's not something you would deliberately want to happen to someone, but many of them volunteered for long hours. They were there with other people. They had a combination of empathy and suffering. They were able to help others in their suffering, and they were able to just pragmatically, accept that this is something bad that happened. They already know that bad things happen to good people. They're not shocked by that. They've been there. They know. So there's a real strength in it. The ones who, they call them now survivors. And we're hoping too that the church can grow beyond some of the issues that we have had. There's a papal commission now to work with survivors of clergy sexual abuse, and we're hoping that this becomes more of an effort, that the church takes a role in moving people beyond places that they really need to be going. And then they talk about resources. One of the things that we do want too is, to help people stay connected. As adults, a lot of people who are trying to recover from clergy sexual abuse, which is why my office was originally started. The victim assistance coordinator was to take information from people who had been abused by clergy, or had been or were being harmed by people who were members of the church. Very often I will get people coming to me now for resources, or for, they will say, I'm looking for a counselor for this or for that, or I'm looking for resources for some level of trauma in my family. And I'm happy to say that I have a lot of resources, and I have done over the last, since 2002, so about 15 years or so, we've come up with a lot of workshops. They found a lot of things that really are good, not just for trauma survivors, but for people in general who want better skills, better compassionate listening skills, better skills for just getting along with people that they love and care about. With Father Thomas, I think about 10 years ago, he came to me and asked if I'd be willing to help him sponsor a group in nonviolent communication. We call that compassionate listening now. In fact, there's a group in town in October, and if any of you are interested, here are some flyers for that workshop. And it's just another wonderful tool for how to learn to be a compassionate listener to other people and to yourself. That's one of the wonderful things about it, is if you become compassionate toward others, first they want you to develop a compassion and an understanding for yourself. And from that, you can share that with other people. Become non-judgmental of yourself. Learn what it takes to stay in a place where you don't feel bad about yourself and who you are, where you feel that love of God. And that's what we hope people will experience here in church. So we really want to share that as much as we can. This woman says, if enough of us believe that every child is our child, and that we are responsible for the safety of every child we know, we can be the most effective instruments of change. If we believe with Pope Francis that churches are field hospitals, then we are the nurses, paramedics, doctors, and of course the patients in our own communities. Any one of us can pick up the phone at any time if we know or suspect that a child is being abused or neglected. It's anonymous, and it is in this town, and it is the right thing to do. If you know or suspect that a priest, a teacher, a bus driver, your best friend's husband, or your next door neighbor, or even your own Uncle Louie is abusing or neglecting a child, there are no good excuses not to call. You can save a life, you may save a soul. So we are all mandatory reporters, by the way, if any of you didn't know that we are required, if we suspect issues with people, to call. The number is here. I don't have it memorized, but you can call me or call the secretaries of the DREs here in the church, and we will certainly help you do that. They talk about other things that people can do. We want people to be in therapy if we need it. We want them to be on medication if they need it. We want them to create self-support communities around themselves if they need that. And most people need all of these things to heal. As a matter of fact, most of us need all of these things just to stay on an even keel. We need to take self-care seriously. And we need to take watching out for others seriously as well. And that is a lot of what we're asked to do here. One of the workshops that I have done is on Brene Brown's workshop on shame resiliency. And I've done that 2 or 3 times with trauma survivors. And she talks about, actually here's another poster for you, as if all these childhood traumas are not enough. We also have other situations in our culture that trigger shame in all of us, regardless of how healthy our childhood was. And this is a poster that we use in the shame resiliency class, and I'll hand this out too. The 12 categories of shame. And a lot of this is just about, it's about parents, it's about how good a mother or father you are, how good a family you've got, religion. Surviving trauma is just one of the many things that people often can feel shame about. Being stereotyped, being labeled, having any kind of mental, physical problems, anything in your family that could cause other people to look down on you or criticize you, money, how much money do you make, what do you do for a living, and appearance and body image is huge. And that's our culture just thrives on these. So again, even people from reasonably normal, healthy families still suffer from shame, because all around us, people are telling us, "Oh, you're not good enough. You might not have, you might not be measuring up." Every place we look, There's somebody to tell us that we're not measuring up, and then to sell us something that will help us feel better than we already do. And that's what a lot of it is about. It's consumerism. It's about trying to convince you that you need to buy something to get this product, and then you'll be better, and then you'll feel okay about yourself. And so we go out and buy something, and it doesn't make us feel better about ourselves, because there's just one more thing to, add to the pile. So this woman, Brene Brown, she's written, her first book was called I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't, Making the Journey from What Do People Think of Me to I Am Enough. So the more people can realize that, you know what, we are enough. We are all enough. We are children of God, right? Don't have to be perfect. And this I think is her best book, called The Gifts of Imperfection. And it's all about vulnerability being the most precious gift. If you really want to strive for something, don't strive to be perfect. Strive to be open. Strive to be real. Strive to be vulnerable with yourself and others. And be open to hearing them and letting them be that way with you. That's where happiness is found. Not in perfection, which is totally an illusion anyway. But we're the ones who have to be smart enough to figure that out. She's done, she's got a CD on men, women, and worthiness, the experience of shame and the power of just being enough. And she talks about the gifts of imperfect parenting, raising children with courage, compassion, and connection. And this is all wonderful information. And again, it's about how to work with children. Let them just be. Don't try and shame people, children especially, for not being enough. So much of us, people my age anyway, were told when we were small, oh, shame on you, shame on you. And mostly it was about, please don't do anything to embarrass me. But it didn't. In the end, it was not a great gift to the children who were, in school or at home, made to feel shame if they weren't perfect. We're not supposed to be perfect. We're supposed to be real. And the workshop that I do on the gifts of imperfection have to do with understanding shame, what it is, where it comes from. And of course, all of these things also cause people great shame. But even just, everyday life, they talk about shame resilience and also the power of empathy. If we can learn to listen to other people with compassion and have empathy for them, which is not the same thing necessarily as sympathy. They talk about empathy means I'm willing to sit with you here in your story and just hear you. Not me standing up here looking down at you saying, oh, too bad for you, that's the way it is. But to be vulnerable enough to just be with someone else when they're suffering and struggling, and don't need to fix it and don't need to judge them for where they are, but to just be there and let them feel okay. And to have somebody that you can do that with, someone that you can call up when you're having a bad day or when things are not feeling right, and you can reflect off of each other. So that's one of the things that we need, recognizing what shame triggers are too. The workshop has people talk about where you feel shame, how you know when that's an issue for you. And very often we might feel hot or embarrassed, or you might feel it someplace in your body somewhere. It's like, oh no, I don't want to go here, I don't want to feel this. This feels terrible. And certain things will trigger different ones of us. And those going into these, what they call a shame attack, triggers a lot of the happy consequences that we tend to go into when we don't feel okay about who we are. So these are all things we want to understand so that we can help the children in our lives not fall into some of these same traps. I have a daughter who works with teenage girls in Eugene, Oregon, and she goes into schools and she does workshops with kids just on being okay with who you are, and what do healthy relationships look like? They look like, find people who accept you and like you just the way you are. Don't try and fit into something where you think you have to be better than you are to be part of it. You really want to, be happy with the way you look, be happy with the way you feel, know that you're not going to feel wonderful all the time, and find people you can talk to about that. Create support communities, and our church should be that community. We should be that for each other. There should be not a place here for judgmentalism or... I remember saying to somebody one time, but I'm so afraid because I'm sure these people... I have a book in the library called What Other People Think of Me Is None of My Business. You know, and most of us are so worried. I was telling a friend one time, but I'm sure, I think it was when I was going to go home to visit my brothers, and I said, oh, but I'm sure they're being critical of me. You know, I'm sure they judge my lifestyle or where I live or how it is. And someone wisely said to me, well, if they did, that's their problem. That's about their need to have to judge people. There's nothing healthy about that. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. Anybody out there can go, if they try, and look for something, you know, to criticize in someone else. You can do that. But that's a cheap, easy shot. That's not what maturity is about. That's not spiritual maturity. That's me putting somebody else down to make myself feel a little bit better. And if those are the kinds of people I'm most worried about, I'm in big trouble. I need to be the person who's okay with who I am and lets other people feel that way around me. That's what we want to offer for our children. So we talk about the ways that you combat shame are, first, you know how it feels in yourself. Be aware of it. Be aware of it when you notice it. And they say, reach out. You know, when I'm feeling shame about something or feeling bad about something, I need to find a safe person and call them and tell them about it. Talk about it. When the more I keep it to myself, the worse I feel. And the more I think, now I can't talk about it. You know, people don't want to hear that. People will blame me for it. Don't be the person who blames somebody else for it. And find people that you can talk to. And they also talk about speaking to shame. You know, it's sort of like the monster in the closet. You know the children's books about the monster in the closet, and he gets so big, and the child is so afraid to get out of bed because it's going to climb out from under the bed or out of the closet. But in most of the stories, when they either turn on the light or they do something, the monster just kind of shrinks away, you know, because it wasn't real anyway. But we tend to think that it is. And if we never speak about the things that we feel like we're ashamed of, or the things that we think are traumatizing us or keeping us down or keeping us in our place, then it continues to have the upper hand. But the woman who wrote these books was telling a story about how when she has done something that she feels bad, that she wished she hadn't done she said, when I was a bad parent or I, you know, made some poor move, she said, I have a friend, my very good friend, and I can call her up and tell her about the terrible thing I did, and I'll say to her, I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to listen to me, and like you always do. And she said, and then I'm going to hang up, and we're never going to talk about it again. We're just going to pretend I never told you that. But she said, I did, and I feel better, and you're going to hold it for me, right? And she says, of course. And then when she had a bad experience, she was feeling down, she could call me, and I would hold her story. I would not share it with people. I would not make fun of it. I would not shame her for it. I would just hold her story. That's what we need, people who can hold our stories. And they talk about practicing courage in a culture that's based on fear, which is what all of the advertising is about. We want to learn to practice compassion in a culture that's into blame. And we want to practice connection in a culture of disconnection. And that was one of the themes of this weekend, was connection, and engaging with each other. So we're trying to create a culture of connection, which is this culture of mercy, this culture of compassion that Pope Francis is inviting us to here in the church. So I will, there's a nonviolent communication workshop going on in another week or two. Let me ask if anybody has any questions about any of this.
What do you do when your middle schoolers are always so overwhelmed with their school responsibilities and tests and all that anxiety? Or what do you do with all of that? I mean, listen, what can you do? Do nothing?
The listening is huge. And kids at that age, I remember at that age, you know, kids want drama. They're kind of into drama in middle school. I remember hearing a friend of mine say, and you know, when we were in middle school, some kid came and said, "Oh, my dad's so lame. He always blah 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 this." And my friend said, yeah, I know what you mean. My dad too, man, he did this or that. And after the other kid went away, I looked at her and I said, your dad doesn't do that. And she said, well, I know, but she said, I have to say something, right? I can't just act like I'm not in there with everybody else, you know? That was the thing to do in middle school, was to complain about your parents and complain about the school and complain about how tough life is, you know? Because when you're little kids, you don't notice that so much, or you don't talk about it so much. But that kind of becomes the thing, you know, in middle school and high school. And it'd be better if they could just, you know, sit down and talk about how they're really feeling, but they tend to want to build themselves up and make a story out of things. And you can listen to their stories. You can be there and hear what it is that they have to say. We're their witnesses. You know, we witness where they are. And hopefully at some point, some of these children, when I was teaching 4th grade CCD years ago, when my children were even younger than that, and my children are in their 40s now, I remember we were talking about prayer, and the kids were saying, I was saying, are there things that you all want to pray about? You know, would you like to pray together as a class? And some of the kids said, well, I don't know if I want to pray out loud. You know, I don't know if I want everybody to know what I'm praying for, but I would like it, you know, if someone else were praying for me. So I said, well, why don't we'll put this box in the middle of the room, and you just write down on this piece of paper what you would like the group to pray for. And every week, we'll just pray for the needs in that box. So they all wrote things down and agreed that, you know, most of them didn't want to say what was on their paper out loud. And somebody before the class was over said, it's okay with me if you read what's on my paper. She said, I just don't want everybody to do it. And I said, so how do the rest of you feel about that? And they said, oh yeah, we want you to read what's on our paper. But don't read it out loud. Don't read it out loud to everybody in the class, because like that would be too embarrassing. So I took that box home and read through their prayer requests. And I had a little boy in my class whose mother was dying of cancer. I had twin boys in my class whose mother had been diagnosed with a brain tumor and later died. I had a little girl in my class whose parents were getting divorced, and we didn't know. And I had another little girl in my class who had a little sister who had gone into a mental institution. And everything that was written down on these pieces of paper, those were the most dramatic ones that I remember. But every child had something that was very important. One little boy's grandfather had just died. And, you know, they didn't want that said out loud because they didn't, you know, want people to think that they thought that was a big deal. But it was very important to them that somebody know it and that people pray for that. So I thought that was very, very powerful, and it really helped me to know how to help them. You know, and some children will be willing to share what's going on, and often if one person does, then other people might. And you know, and you could share something of your own if you want, but it's not about manipulating kids into saying out loud, you know, things that they don't want to say. You don't want to do that. You don't want to shame them or embarrass them. And if they're not ready to tell it, but you can still pray for them. Whatever it is that's going on to them, you need to let them know that what is going on for them is really important to you. And you will be happy to pray for them, whether they want to tell you what it is or not. Everybody needs that. Everybody wants that level of support, that somebody's there helping. And again, remember that about all of these childhood issues, again, it's not just in the children that you're dealing with. And on top of this, then come all of the traumas that all of us who are grown know come with adult life too. You know, it's not like trauma ends at the end of childhood. Or that the only drama we have is the ones that we create for ourselves. But there are things over which we have no control that happen to us at every age of life. And which means that the other people sitting with us in the pews, and the people that are teaching with us, and the people that are neighbors are struggling, just like we are. And it's really been healing and helpful to me to be in groups over years where people will share their stories. And often if someone does, then other people do too. I've done a 12-step workbook study of people that came from alcoholic or dysfunctional families, where people kind of go through their childhood stage by stage and tell their stories. And many people will say to me, I never said that out loud before, ever. until I was in a group and I heard someone else tell their story. And that let it be okay, because that's part of coming from dysfunctional family very often, is that one of the rules, they say the rules that you learn if your family was challenging is don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel. And you do not say out loud what was wrong. And you don't trust other people, and you certainly don't tell other people anything. And the best you can, stuff your feelings down about it, because it's not going to do you any good anyway. And those are all terrible responses. They get you nowhere as an adult. But those were the things that people learn as survival skills. So if you're looking for workshops, if you're looking for books and materials, if you are looking for resources or counselors, or if you guys would ever want to do any of these groups here, we could do groups here. We could do shame resiliency. I've done inner child workshops. I've done nonviolent communication workshops. Shame resiliency. We've got pretty much anything out there, and as far as I'm concerned, it's good for everybody. I'm not real convinced that there's people that are not codependent or not in some way have some issues that it wouldn't be more helpful to them to have other people that they're working with and that they can trust and they can have as a support system. I'm a huge believer in support groups, whatever it is you're going through. And I remember when my first child was born, I was in a group of women in a Lamaze class. And the woman who taught our class was this just perky young woman who said, people told me how painful childbirth was, but I did this class, and she said, I followed everything, and I did my breathing, and when my child was born, I had a perfectly painless childbirth. And she said, so if you all just follow me and follow my directions, you will too, she said to this room full of 20 mothers and fathers. And as I was going through childbirth, my natural childbirth with my oldest child, I remember thinking to myself, I am going to kill that woman. She's so lied to me. But then we stayed together, and we became a nursing mothers group, and then we became a preschool mothers group, and we became all of these other. And I still remember some of those men and women when my kids were graduating from high school. And I taught preschool here in this building, and I remember our little group of preschoolers, and when they all graduated from high school, and they're all in their mid-30s now. Yeah. So I'm grateful for the support and for everybody who's willing to volunteer here. You folks are the frontline people. So I will close if there's no other questions with I also believe in daily meditations. I read everything I can find. I get a Catholic meditation I read every day. I read nonviolent communication. I read a recovery meditation. I need all the inspiration I can get. And this one is from Nonviolent Communication, and it's just a quote at the beginning, and it says, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. That's true.